Today, we'll look at recent developments regarding the Taiwan region, where the authorities in Taipei, along with the G7, seem to be creating the conditions for another Ukraine-type provocation, this time against China. We'll discuss this and more in this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm KJ Noh. These are this week's headlines. DPP leadership wants to institute military tribunals to prevent Chinese influence on Taiwan Island. In possibly the most belligerent statements to date by the ruling DPP party, Taipei called China a foreign hostile force and called for military tribunals to prosecute Beijing's influence on the Taiwan region. 17 measures were proposed, including military courts, tightening residency criteria, and audits of officials who visit the mainland. In a move that echoes what is happening to Palestinian activists in the United States, a Chinese influencer with Taiwanese residents through marriage was stripped of her residency and deported for explaining Beijing's position on Taiwan's secession in her posts. This is despite the guarantee of freedom of speech and media in the Taiwan Constitution and the DPP party platform. G7 issues belligerent statement against China on Taiwan. G7, the powerful group of ultra-capitalist former colonial powers, released a belligerent statement against China one day after Taipei's aggressive statements against China. In Canada, the foreign ministers of the G7 released a statement attacking and condemning China, Russia, and Palestine, while removing language committing the G7 to a constructive and stable relationship with China. The statement also omitted reference to their previous recognition of the One China policy. They condemned the provision of weapons and dual-use components by China, which they called a decisive enabler of Russia's war and of the reconstitution of Russia's armed forces. The Chinese embassy responded that the G7 statement ignores facts and China's solemn position, grossly interferes in China's internal affairs, and blatantly smears China, and urged the G7 to stop creating bloc confrontation and fueling tensions in the region. Chinese humanoid robots to participate in Beijing Marathon. 23 Chinese robotics manufacturers are preparing to compete in the Beijing Half Marathon on April 15th with humanoid robots. Chinese robots have demonstrated their ability to do manufacturing, household, and service tasks. They can also dance and do martial arts. The marathon will demonstrate their capacity for stable, upright, bipedal running for 23 kilometers and test the ability to endure intensive torque and mechanical stress. No Western manufacturer is entering this race. Chinese animated film Ne Jia challenges Hollywood's dominance. The Chinese animated film Ne Jia recently became the highest-grossing animated film of all time and the fifth highest-grossing film in cinema history. The film is now headed to European theaters. The Chinese folklore-based film, which has seen astounding box office success, is considered by many critics to be an allegory of resistance against U.S. domination. The depictions of the oppressive forces are peppered with references to the U.S. and the Pentagon. According to noted commentator Arnaud Bertrand, Ne Jia is potentially rewriting the rules about what messages can dominate global entertainment. Chinese researchers pioneer method to harness the body's own immune system to defeat cancer. Chinese cancer researchers at Guangxi Medical University have found a groundbreaking method to defeat cancer by harnessing the body's own immune responses. Using a genetically modified virus to mark cancer cells as foreign tissue, the method triggers a hyperacute response from the body's own immune system. This response rejects the cancer as a foreign body while leaving healthy cells untouched. Early trials have reported astounding clinical success. 90% of patients with advanced treatment-resistant cancers saw shrinkage or arrested growth of tumors. As the U.S. discusses truce in Ukraine, many commentators have pointed out that de-escalation in Ukraine signals not military restraint, but military reprioritization, preparation for kinetic war with China. Taiwan is considered one of the most likely places where this kinetic war could be triggered. In today's China report, we will explore recent developments in and around Taiwan that heighten tension and signal the potential for yet another war. To discuss this, we are delighted to have Benjamin Norton join us again. Ben is the editor of Geopolitical Economy Report and one of the top analysts in China. Welcome back, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Ben. Ben, there have been recent developments regarding Taiwan Island. As we noted in the headlines, Taipei referred to China as a foreign hostile force, and they called for military tribunals to prosecute Beijing's influence on the Taiwan region. They introduced 17 measures, including military courts. What is going on? Can you give us some analysis of why there is this incredible escalation right now?
Yeah, well, the stated reason is this was the 20th anniversary of the anti-secession law, but really this is part of a larger campaign that we've seen growing in recent years, provoked by the U.S., which is essentially trying to cause a conflict. And this could potentially even be a war, as you were mentioning earlier. I mean, there's a very real possibility of there being an actual war breaking out over this because the U.S. is supporting these very extreme forces in Taiwan that do not have majority among the majority of the people in Taiwan. We need to emphasize that. If you look at poll after poll, they consistently show that more than 80% of people in Taiwan want to maintain the status quo. What does that mean? It means that over time, the Chinese mainland and Taiwan will have more and more interchange. People go across the Taiwan Strait. There's more economic integration. And over time, there will be peaceful reunification. But because the majority of people want that, and they don't want this extreme agenda of secession, which polls show only has the support of a small number of people, less than 10%, the U.S. is pushing this very extreme agenda and is essentially trying to provoke a conflict. And we've seen this happen in several ways. Of course, it's not just the Donald Trump administration. We saw this under Joe Biden. There were some very provocative actions taken, for instance, by Nancy Pelosi when she went to Taiwan and did not go to the mainland. But now what we've also seen under the Trump administration, especially in the State Department under Marco Rubio, is that the U.S. government has taken several steps recently that are clear green lights for secessionist forces in Taiwan. Now, of course, this happens at the same time when the Trump administration is bombing Yemen brutally, and also when Trump gave the green light to Israel to restart the war in Gaza. So, all the MAGA Republicans falsely claiming that Trump is an anti-war populist. Well, he restarted the war in Gaza, he's expanding the war in Yemen, and his administration is pushing essentially for this war over Taiwan. And what we saw recently is that the Marco Rubio State Department dropped the language in which it said that it opposed Taiwan independence. Now, of course, that was just rhetorical. We've known for many decades that the U.S. government had this policy of what's known as strategic ambiguity, where the U.S. would publicly say that it recognizes the one China policy, that is, that there's only one China and Taiwan is part of China. This is written into international law. If you go to the United Nations, there is one China, the People's Republic of China, and the UN recognizes Taiwan as a province of China. Even if you look at bodies like the International Monetary Fund, which is dominated by the West, if you go to their website and look at their economic data, it says Taiwan, province of China. So on paper, the US government has recognized this in the 3 communiques that Washington signed with Beijing in 1972, 1979, and 1982. The US reaffirmed that it recognized the one China policy. Well, actually, let me take that back. The language is a little vague as well. In the Shanghai Communique signed in 1972, and when Richard Nixon went to China and normalized relations, started the normalization process, the official language of the Shanghai Communique is that the US government recognizes that both sides consider there only to be one China. So even the language has this element of strategic ambiguity. But it's been known that for decades, the US technically recognized this reality, at least formally. But of course, in recent decades, the US has had this policy of supporting separatist movements and selling more and more weapons to Taiwan. And so Marco Rubio's State Department removed that language. And then after that happened, the G7 held a meeting and the foreign ministers released a joint statement. Of course, the G7 is the group of 7 imperialist countries that colonized most of the world, North America, Europe, and Japan. And in their joint statement, they removed language that was previously used in which they expressed support for the one China policy, and they included much more aggressive anti-China rhetoric. So what we've seen is clear signs from the US government and from the G7 that were interpreted by these extremist forces in Taiwan who only have the support of a tiny percentage of elites. The vast majority of the population does not support their agenda. And they're pushing this very extreme agenda because I think they recognize that time is not on their side, that over time it's inevitable that as the mainland and Taiwan province have more and more interchange and trade, peaceful reunification will just happen organically. So what's happening is the US is trying to provoke conflict to prevent the possibility of peaceful reunification. And, they have some people in the DPP, which is the current ruling party of Taiwan, who do support this very extreme agenda, and they're willing to create military tribunals and imprison people for opposing their extremist agenda.
Yes, Ben, that was the thing that really jumped out at me. I mean, military tribunals are a legacy of Taiwan's military dictatorship. And I think it's been over a decade that they have been already outlawed. But this current DPP administration wants to bring them back. Now, we know that Taiwan Island has a long history of authoritarianism and military dictatorship. It didn't even have a presidential election until 1996. And globally, it was considered, a bad actor. It was one of an axis of rogue states, along with South Africa, Israel, Taiwan, and some Latin American dictatorships. And so there's a kind of a myth that has been put out as part of this information warfare that somehow Taiwan is a model democracy. Can you unpack that a little bit? This language, this propaganda that Taiwan is some kind of model that we should be looking up to from a historical standpoint.
Well, you're absolutely right. And what's funny is it's not just Taiwan province, which again is, according to international law, recognized as part of China. But, there are other states in East Asia that had very similar histories. South Korea was a military dictatorship until 1988, 1989. Also, Japan has only ever basically been a one-party state since after World War II. It's known as the 1955 system. There were like 3 years in which there was another party briefly in power, but basically Japan has been a one-party state posing as a so-called democracy. And, it's also funny, a quick note, is that if you look at the Asian tigers, as they're known, their economic model, there's this myth in the West that they all developed through capitalism and free markets, which is not at all true. It's the exact opposite. They all had very heavy interventionist state-led economies In the case of South Korea, the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee nationalized all the banks. He had a state-led industrialization campaign being led by state-owned enterprises. I mean, the case is very similar in other parts of East Asia, certainly in Singapore, even in Japan before the neoliberal era. So the point is that there's this idea that East Asia, that there are these states that are all models of capitalism and democracy, which totally erases the history that until the 80s or 90s, most of them were military dictatorships and had very interventionist state-led economies that were not in any way neoliberal capitalist economies. And in the 80s and 90s, they liberalized, and then they also became, bourgeois democracies. And we've seen how undemocratic they are. In the case of South Korea, the political system is dominated by the chaebols, which are these huge corporate monopolies, and corruption is so rampant that you have, for instance, corporate executives from companies like Samsung that commit blatant crimes and they're imprisoned, and then the government releases them because Samsung is so important to the South Korean economy. So anyway, Taiwan province is very similar to that kind of situation where, if you understand that history, it makes more sense in that historical context where the U.S. needed important allies in East Asia in order to counter the People's Republic of China and the former Soviet Union. And those allies were Taiwan province, this rogue province, where the U.S. was supporting these separatist forces, and then, of course, South Korea and Japan. And now what we've seen is that in the past few decades, China has become the world's largest economy. Its economic growth has been incredible, without precedent in human history. And GDP measured at purchasing power parity has increased by more than 50 times. Not 50%, 50 times. And now China is the world's leading manufacturing superpower. It's responsible for about 1/3 of global manufacturing production. And what's happened is that many of these East Asian economies, including Taiwan province, but also South Korea and Japan, they've traded more and more. And as they have more economic integration with China, it's also led to at least attempts by some political forces to improve political relations. This is actually very funny because, we were talking about the history of Taiwan. When Taiwan was a military dictatorship, the ruling party was the Kuomintang, known as the KMT or the GMD. And what's funny is, historically, the Kuomintang they're the nationalists. Actually, if you go back to the beginning of the Kuomintang, they actually were allied with the communists against the Japanese imperialists. And especially in the early stages, the Chinese nationalists under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, who represented the left-wing Chinese nationalist movement, they had this popular front. But then with the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, the right wing of the Chinese nationalist movement, they took a very hard line against the Chinese communists and started killing a lot of the Chinese communists, and some of them collaborated with the Japanese and such. Anyway, the point is that, so during the time of, the Cold War, the first Cold War, the Kuomintang was a loyal U.S. ally and was very much against the mainland. But actually, one of these historical ironies that it's quite funny, in the past 20 or 30 years or so, the Kuomintang has actually become the party in Taiwan that supports better relations with the Chinese mainland because they recognize that there's only one China. Now, it's funny, they used to believe that one day that they would launch a military offensive from Taiwan and retake the mainland. It's obviously never going to happen in a million years. They recognize that. But still, a lot of political forces in the Kuomintang want better relations with the mainland, and they have accused the DPP, which is, this US-backed party, secessionist party, they've accused them of essentially selling out their own economy. And in particular, major companies like TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which is one of the most important companies on earth. TSMC produces the majority of the most advanced semiconductors, advanced chips that are needed for high-tech technology in the world today. And Trump has made this a key part of his strategy with Taiwan, where Trump, of course, he already has put tariffs repeatedly on mainland China during his first term, and now in his second term, he's put 2 more rounds of tariffs. The average tariff rate on the mainland on China is now over 30%. It's the average tariff rate. He's paused the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, but he's continued imposing them on China. And Trump is also threatening to expand those tariffs to also touch Taiwan province. And as part of his leverage, he's trying to force TSMC to leave Taiwan and to open its factories in the United States, in particular in Arizona. TSMC has already opened factories for fabricating semiconductors. And it's not just investing billions of dollars in capital expenditure in the US, but also thousands of Taiwanese workers have gone to Arizona. They've moved with their families to work in these factories because in the US is deindustrialized. You have entire generations that don't know how to produce advanced manufactured goods. So what Trump is essentially trying to do is, while his administration, and in particular Marco Rubio, is pushing this aggressive policy that could cause a war, meanwhile, Trump is essentially telling Taiwan, give us your most important companies and intellectual property because we're going to provoke a war and all that might be destroyed. So at least we can have that in the United States.
So that really signals what the US interests are, that they're certainly not interested in Taiwan's democracy or any of the human rights, quote, discourse that they're putting out, but it really is about self-interest.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny hearing this rhetoric today about Taiwan being a model of democracy because, as we were just discussing, for the majority of the time after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, when the Kuomintang took over Taiwan, for the majority of the time that's been this rogue province, it has not been a bourgeois democracy. It was under a military dictatorship, and only in the past few decades they tried to rebrand. But actually, it's really skin deep. We can see how thin, how superficial their commitment to so-called democracy is, because now they're threatening to bring back the military tribunals that they had for decades. As soon as the rubber hits the road, the same thing in South Korea. I mean, we saw that the current leader, Yoon Suk Yeol, if you want to call him the current leader, his status is in a gray area. But the point is that he attempted a military coup. He attempted to assassinate his political rivals with the support of the U.S. And at that time, it was Joe Biden. But now Trump's in, and he's not going to even make a pretense of supporting democracy. So we see how, and then I already mentioned that Japan has been a one-party state, basically almost without exception since 1955. So, this idea of these East Asian so-called democracies being models, it's always been propaganda used by the United States. And what's especially concerning is who are going to pay the consequences. It's going to be the people of this region. It's going to be the people of Taiwan, also the people of the Chinese mainland. If there's a war, who knows how many people would die? People from the U.S. military aren't going to die. It's compared to Ukraine, and there are parallels, although, of course, there's a difference. Ukraine is not part of Russia. Taiwan is part of China. It's recognized as part of China by the United Nations. And yet the U.S. is promoting this insane kind of secessionist policy. It would be like if China was arming secessionists in Florida who said that they refused to recognize the federal U.S. government. They said that Florida is an independent state and that Washington is a hostile enemy. I mean, that's essentially what the U.S. has been doing in China. But we see in Ukraine the consequences. The U.S. told Ukraine, we're going to support you. We're your ally, as they pushed Ukrainians into the cannon fodder into the line of fire. And the U.S. was willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And now we see that the U.S. is willing to fight to the last Taiwanese.
Ben, I want to pick up on the Ukraine piece, because as the Ukraine war was progressing, the Taiwanese DPP leadership was actually very, very much in support of Ukraine. And I remember at the time...
And Israel.
And Israel, absolutely. And they said at the time that, referring to the Maidan, they said, we hope that we can have a happy ending like the Ukrainians did themselves. And so you can see this kind of very, very distorted worldview that they have. But we also know that historically, Taiwan Island, as kind of the center or the clearinghouse of global dictatorships, of global fascism, if you will, had a strong relationship to Ukraine, to Ukrainian Nazis. to Lithuanian Nazis, and also it had strong support, or it was a major backer of Latin American dictatorships. I'm talking about, for example, they had the P2 Political Warfare Cadres Academy, and this was like the School of America on steroids. That is to say, it exported death squad training to Latin America, to Asia, to Africa. It was kind of this sub-imperial contractor for U.S. dirty wars, the wars that were so dirty that they could not actually put them on the CIA books. And so it has this like long and ugly history of subverting democracy rather than quote unquote being a model of democracy. But at the same time, you can see that the propaganda is so extreme in the West that people still believe that Taiwan is some kind of model political system. And they also seem to be buying into this language that the DPP is putting out, that Taiwan is de facto independent. Would it really be independent? I mean, everything points to the fact that it is currently, the current government is a U.S. Vassal, essentially a U.S. client state. They openly vaunt their relationship with the now defunct NED. But what's your take on this? I mean, is there any credence to the notion that Taiwan is quote unquote de facto independent?
No, and I will respond to that in 1 second, but I just want to briefly also respond to something you mentioned, which was the World Anti-Communist League that was founded in Taiwan during the first Cold War by Chiang Kai-shek, and it was later rebranded as the World League for Freedom and Democracy. And this, as you mentioned, brought together a bunch of anti-communist groups around the world, including fascists, European fascists who had collaborated with the Third Reich, including Latin American dictatorships, and Taiwan being the original host of this. And who was on the board of that was John McCain, the old neoconservative Republican senator. So I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that history, because this idea again of Taiwan being a supposed model of democracy is so laughable if you know even the basic history of Taiwan, modern history of Taiwan. To answer your question now, so I think what we're seeing here is that the DPP they understand that they don't care about democracy, that it's a slogan that they used to justify this mission of secessionism. And originally during the first Cold War, the U.S. didn't really care about, I mean, they still used this rhetoric of democracy and human rights, but they didn't care about openly supporting military dictatorships. By the 1980s, it was clear that the U.S. was winning the first Cold War. And then the CIA starts to rebrand. They create the National Endowment for Democracy. And as the co-founder of the NED said famously in the Washington Post, he admitted that we do what the CIA did previously, but we do it overtly as opposed to covertly. And then the U.S. pressured these former military dictatorships to create, bourgeois capitalist democracies in which rich people could just buy the elections. So in the case of South Korea, we talked about 1988, 1989 having the first election. And by the way, the first person who won, the candidate who won the first election in South Korea was a general, a military general. So you go from an unelected military regime to an elected military regime. And then, of course, in Taiwan, you have this transition, and the U.S. supports the DPP because they need to rebrand what's happening, because obviously everyone could see that the Kuomintang was affiliated, they were associated with far-right movements and military dictatorship. And we saw the same thing in Latin America. The U.S. supported these military regimes in Argentina and Brazil, and the U.S. tells them, okay, you need to Chile under Pinochet, you need to have a bourgeois capitalist democracy. Instead of having a military general in charge, you should have a billionaire rule your country. And that's what we saw in the neoliberal era in the 1990s and 2000s. And that worked for a while because the U.S. was the unipolar power in the world. There was no systemic challenge, large-scale, significant systemic challenge to the U.S. So the U.S. could preach this idea of democracy and free markets. But now what we've seen is the situation has changed geopolitically. And there are systemic challenges led by China and BRICS and new institutions in which the Global South has protagonism. And the Global South, if you look at IMF data, for instance, the language they use is that emerging economies, low income, formerly colonized countries now represent about 60% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity, whereas the advanced economies, as they put it, the colonizing countries that colonize most of the world, they represent 40% of global GDP PPP. And 30 years ago, it was the exact reversal. It was 60% of the advanced economies and 40% for the emerging economies. So we've seen a massive shift. And as the US has lost its hegemony, it no longer can use this idea of supporting democracy and human rights. It has to go back to the blunt, hard fist of imperialism. And this is why we've seen that, even under Biden, but especially under Trump, they've removed all reference to democracy and human rights. They said that they're getting rid of the USAID, which is actually not true. USAID was simply merged into the State Department, and it's doing its same operations covertly as opposed to overtly, because you could see everything that USAID was funding. So they're going back to the same playbook of the original First Cold War, which is supporting repression, military dictatorships, no longer even pretending to be a force of democracy and human rights, and ending their overt operations and going back to their covert operations. And this is why the DPP, which claims to be democratic and progressive in its name, is saying, yeah, we need to bring back the military tribunals because we don't have the support of the majority of the population. They did not win a majority in the election, by the way. The vote was split three ways, and they ended up, finagling their way into power, but they do not represent the majority of the population. So they have to resort to these kinds of repressive tactics that were used during the original Cold War. And I expect in the decades to come, we're going to see much more overt repression by the US and its allies because, in the unipolar era, it was strong enough that it didn't need to resort to that overt repression. Now it does need to go back to that.
I agree with you, Ben. I think that it's very, very clear that the world is shifting back to the mailed fist as opposed to the kind of, soft, propaganda techniques that we used before. And I think it's just right now there's this naked power, assertion of power. We see that, as you pointed out, in South Korea, the near reversion to a military dictatorship, still tremendous uncertainty about what will happen in South Korea. We certainly see that in the Philippines. We certainly see that in Taiwan Island, where they are openly talking about bringing back, as you pointed out, military tribunals. And, just coming back to the DPP itself, you pointed out that they did not have a majority. They won 40% of the vote and actually 28% of the electorate. And in any fully functioning democracy, those numbers would have led to a runoff election. But instead, they had first past the post, which is only done in 20 countries, namely the Taiwan region in South Korea and 18 other countries, which the US brands, every single one of them, as authoritarian states. And so I think it's very interesting that, the US has this, double standard around what constitutes democratic or undemocratic. We know that this is largely, a label that it decides arbitrarily. But I just want to lift up the fact that, as you pointed out, the vast majority of people do not want anything like what the DPP is proposing for them, which is to turn the country into the next Ukraine. They do not want to be turned into cannon fodder for the US empire. And it seems that the US is doing everything humanly possible to trigger this confrontation. Going back to the history a little bit, why is Taiwan so geostrategically important, both for China, and the United States. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this. This is so important. So originally, after the victory of the revolution in 1949, the People's Republic actually did try to retake Taiwan. And there were attempts that failed because at that time the Chinese Navy was very weak. And of course, the U.S. was supporting the Kuomintang forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. And in the 1950s, there were more conflicts, including the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, which culminated in 1958, in which the U.S. military came very close to using nuclear weapons. This is such an important point to keep in mind. We know this because Daniel Ellsberg, the late whistleblower hero who recently passed away, he actually was supposed to disclose information about this back in the 70s, and when he disclosed information about the Vietnam War in the Pentagon Papers. But because of all the legal issues that he was caught up in, he wasn't, and also because this long story where he lost a lot of documents that he like buried at his brother's house. Long story. Anyway, he wasn't able to disclose some of this information that he had wanted to disclose then. But we now know that in the second Taiwan Strait crisis in the late 1950s, that Eisenhower was the one who personally rejected the question of, that is to say that the Pentagon wanted to use nuclear weapons, and they asked him if he would give them approval, and he said no. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing Eisenhower to drop nuclear bombs on the Chinese mainland over Taiwan. That's how important it was. And let's not forget that the Korean War was not just a Korean war. It was obviously an international war led by the United States, but also China played an important role in this war. And it's not a coincidence that the U.S. started this war in 1950, right after the victory of the Chinese Revolution on the 1st of October in 1949. The U.S. was hoping to prevent the spread of revolution in Korea and then use Korea as an outpost to wage counter-revolution in China, just as they were using Taiwan. And of course, the Second Taiwan Strait crisis happened a few years later. So the U.S. was using Taiwan as a big military base to right off just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. For instance, I've gone to Fujian, the southern province in southern mainland China, and you can go to Fujian, and there are parts of what are recognized as part of Taiwan, including Jinmen, also known in English as Kinmen, which is just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. And there were reports that the U.S. military has had troops in Kinmen or Jinmen, which is recognized as part of Taiwan, just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. There are U.S. troops there. There are U.S. troops training Taiwanese forces for a potential war in the future. I already talked about how the U.S. military the U.S. government has sold billions of dollars to Taiwan, despite the fact that in the third communique that the U.S. signed with China in 1982, the U.S. pledged that over time it would stop selling weapons to Taiwan. That was in 1982. Now, the language is not specific about when they will stop selling weapons, but come on, I mean, how many decades do we have to wait? Maybe they meant, okay, in the year 2300, we'll stop selling weapons. But come on, I mean, the U.S. is obviously violating the spirit of the agreement that it signed. And in terms of the position of Taiwan, I mentioned that the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to use nuclear weapons in the 1950s. They had nuclear weapons stored on Taiwan. This was disclosed also by the National Security Archive in Washington, which is a great think tank and research institution. And they got access to documents that show from the U.S. government that they had nuclear weapons stored there. And when Richard Nixon went to the mainland in 1972, one of the stipulations was that the U.S., in order for China to agree to normalize relations with the United States, the U.S. had to agree to recognize the One China policy, and the U.S. had to agree to close its military base on Taiwan and to remove nuclear weapons, which is what they did. So another reason, of course, that the U.S. wants control over Taiwan And this gets to this issue. Sorry, I guess I never really directly answered your question earlier about whether or not Taiwan is truly independent. No, it's not de facto independent, and it won't be de facto independent. I already talked about how, according to international law, it's not independent. It's recognized as part of China. But also, when you talk about independence, if these extremist forces in Taiwan were to declare de jure independence, not just de facto as they claim, but if they were to say legally we consider ourselves independent, obviously that would cause a war. But in addition to that, they would not be independent because they would essentially be a colony of the United States. And this is why people who
military base, yes, a U.S. military base. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is why people who, people on the left who have this rhetoric of supporting the sovereignty and the self-determination of the people of Taiwan, you cannot have self-determination when the U.S. government controls you. This is the whole thing with Ukraine as well. I mean, what Trump is doing right now is ironically trying to impose an unequal treaty on Ukraine. Even the Telegraph, the mainstream British newspaper, referred to what Trump's doing to Ukraine as economic colonialism that will give the U.S. control over Ukraine's natural resources and the U.S. government control over what the Ukrainian government spends with the money that it gets from exporting its natural resources. The same thing with Taiwan. If these forces were to declare literal independence and not what they call de facto independence, the U.S. government would control them. I mean, it already basically tries to control them. And what the U.S. wants is to build a new military base on Taiwan to prepare for a war with the mainland and to put nuclear weapons on Taiwan. Can you imagine if China wanted to put nuclear weapons in like Florida or something, or California? There was a big California secessionist movement. Imagine China supported California secessionists and they declared themselves independent. And then China built a big military base in California and then put nuclear weapons in California. What would be the response of the U.S. government?
I think that's pretty clear what it would be. It would be immediate. I think, yeah. But, just kind of to add to what you've already said, I think there's pretty clear evidence that there are at least several hundred Green Beret on Jinmen Island. And Jinmen Island, as you point out, is swimming distance. It's 3 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland, which is to say that the United States has sent a message to China that when war happens, you are not even going to get out of the end zone, that we put the tripwire so close to, your nose that you're not even going to be able to play, the ball onto the court. And at the same time, we see the constant, provocations along the Taiwan Strait, sending U.S. and NATO vessels right through the Taiwan Strait in these belligerent naval maneuvers. They call them freedom of operations. No such thing exists under naval law. But once again, to use the sports metaphor, it's like constantly driving into the paint over and over again, trying to draw a foul. And I think all of this is grounded with also the U.S. preparations, legislative preparations that have been in place for many, many years now. The Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act essentially was a plan to micromanage both Taiwan's military, to micro-audit and micromanage it, as well as its political affairs, in order to turn the entire country into, as many people have said, an unsinkable aircraft carrier that is simply a U.S. pawn in its continued escalation and provocation against China. Coming back to the nuclear dimension, we know that there were the single integrated operational plans, the PSYOP nuclear plans. And during the late 50s and 60s, the plan was not only to destroy the Soviet Union in a preemptive strike, but as they were waging nuclear war with the Soviet Union, they would simply destroy 70% of China City just for the heck of it, right? It's a twofer. China was already having difficulties with the Soviet Union at the time. The Sino-Soviet split was already happening. but the US plans at the time were simply to wipe out China, destroy 70% of its cities just because it could. And so I think that really heightens the strategic risk that Taiwan, quote unquote, independence poses to China, that it is not independence. It's not independence of the sort. In fact, Taiwan has never really been independent. It's simply been a US para-colony, sometimes more obviously and more, demonstratively and aggressively a US para-colony. And then sometimes it's been used as a hedge and as a kind of a subcontractor for US dirty wars and US political actions that it wants to keep off the books. And now it seems like it's coming back directly into becoming a US military base and that, unsinkable aircraft carrier. So I think it's pretty clear that, the threat is really from the United States using Taiwan as its, forward base. But still, there is such an extraordinary trope, that it is China that is threatening Taiwan, and that Taiwan is some kind of independent and separate culture that the Chinese are trying to infringe upon. Can you say a little bit about that? Is Taiwan a separate? Is Taiwan not Chinese? Is this actually a credible statement to make?
Well, this is what the DPP has tried to do, is try to create this idea of a separate Taiwanese culture. I mean, we were talking about the history of the Kuomintang and the many problems with the Kuomintang. But again, this is one of these historic ironies, right? Which is that historically, because the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek and still today had this idea that there is only one China and that they thought that they were going to be able to take the mainland. And now, the Kuomintang leadership today is more lucid and realizes it's never going to happen. But they still recognize that they're part of China. And when they say that they're part of China, it's not just political, it's also cultural and civilizational. They recognize that Taiwan has been historically part of China for many centuries, well before the revolution of 1949. I mean, you can go back to the Qing dynasty, and I'm certainly not a defender and a fan of the Qing dynasty, but go back and look at their maps. I mean, before the United States existed as a country, Taiwan was part of China. And yet now the US is saying, oh, Taiwan's not part of, it's nonsense. At least, actually, legally, formally, the US government's not saying that, but some US politicians are saying that because, again, this is the whole strategic ambiguity. But, I mean, Taiwan has been part of China for many centuries, and this idea that Taiwan is a separate culture is a very new political phenomenon. And you could say, fine, every culture is politically constructed. Okay, fine. But it's part of a political project by the DPP with support from the US government and funding from US government agencies and institutions like the NED and USAID. They've cultivated these groups for the past few decades to try to, as part of a kind of culture war, to support the political war and the secessionist movement.
And they've also done it through the schools. The entire school curriculum has been changed so that China is separated out from, quote unquote, the history of the Taiwan region. I've been told that Chinese history now is a separate subject, like world history, rather than part of the history of the region itself. But I've always been struck by the fact that, people talk about the Taiwanese dialect, which is called Minnanhua. And Minnanhua is actually the language of the Fujian region in mainland China. And of course, the river Min is a river in China. Minnan means south of the river Min. And so it's essentially Fujian language, which they're claiming is, it's just another dialect of Chinese. And I think the other thing which is so very striking is if you go to the National Museum on Taiwan Island, it has 700,000 pieces of Chinese art. In fact, it is the largest collection of Chinese art in the world. And so there seems to be some, deep contradictions inside their, ideological campaign.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick note. You raised great points, and especially about the dialect issue, by the way. For people who don't know, you know, uh, people often conflate Mandarin and Chinese, but Mandarin is, I mean, Chinese is very broad. There are many different Chinese dialects and internal languages that are not mutually intelligible inside the mainland. There are many. I mean, so China, the mainland has 56 recognized ethnic groups, including the Han and 55 minorities. And there are many different languages recognized. And in each different province in the autonomous regions, they have on all the public signs, they have their own language, and then they have Mandarin. And as you mentioned, I mean, Taiwan's dialect is basically identical to that of Fujian, the southern province in the mainland. And also, the Mandarin spoken by the majority of people in Taiwan is completely intelligible to people from the mainland. I mean, they constantly speak with each other. I just did an interview a few days ago with someone from Taiwan and someone from the mainland. We were speaking in English. My Chinese isn't that good enough yet, but they were speaking to each other in Chinese before the interview started. And, this reminds me of another quick point, which is about Hong Kong, because we've seen similar propaganda about Hong Kong, except, Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997, and Macau was a Portuguese colony until 1999. And there's this part of the propaganda used by the DPP and separatists in Taiwan is they have this idea that we can never be, peacefully reunified with the mainland because they will repress us and won't allow us to have our own system. But that actually ignores the precedents. Look at what happened in Hong Kong and look what happened in Macau. There's been all this propaganda about Hong Kong, but Hong Kong still has its own system as part of what's known as one country, two systems. So Hong Kong still has its own kind of neoliberal capitalist system. And ironically, one of the reasons that there were so many protests in Hong Kong is because of the very high cost of living and real estate in Hong Kong, in no small part due to the capitalist policies of the Hong Kong authorities. And in the case of Macau, it's notorious for having legal gambling and having casinos and such. I mean, they still, the Chinese authorities still respect this idea of one country and two systems. And when Taiwan is reintegrated into China, which is inevitable, it's going to happen, they're probably going to have some kind of similar system, similar policy of one country and two systems. So this idea that like the mainland is just going to repress, even if people in Taiwan want to say that they have their own independent identity and culture, like maybe people in Hong Kong will say, there are differences in Hong Kong because of the history of British colonialism. A lot of people speak English and they speak Chinese. Okay, fine. They can have their own unique cultural tradition and dialect and such in Taiwan like they do in Hong Kong, but they're still going to be part of China. So one country, two systems.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight that, China is a civilizational state consisting of many cultures, of which, Fujianese culture is just one. And it also has multiple autonomous regions and, of course, many systems inside its own national polity. I wanted to highlight also, there's a discourse among the DPP secessionist types that tries to claim indigeneity as a part of its claim to sovereignty, which is very, very odd because the indigenous people of Taiwan Island, they're about 2.3% of the population, actually support good relations with China and by and large vastly support the KMT, which is in favor of good relations, if not reunification of some sort with China. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that in China, the ethnic minorities are 8% of the population, and they possess 45% of the land, of the territory of mainland China, whereas on Taiwan Island, they're 2.3% of the population, and they have absolutely no possession of their own lands. In fact, they are a highly dispossessed and oppressed minority that really has no rights other than a kind of Disneyfied fetishization, which the DPP uses as some kind of claim to sovereignty, which is completely belied by the beliefs and the politics of the indigenous themselves. I know we're getting into some, very kind of granular pieces, but I was curious whether you had any comments about that too.
No, you raised exactly the point that I would have made. Great point. And this is, again, one of these funny historical ironies where the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist party, and Chiang Kai-shek were the ones who repressed the ethnic minorities in Taiwan because they had this idea of a Chinese nation, right? It's the whole idea of the nationalist party. And now it's the DPP, the rivals of the Kuomintang, that are bringing back this idea of saying that we represent indigenous people, but actually they're the descendants of the people who displaced the indigenous people. And now they're the ones saying, oh, we're indigenous. I mean, it's like, people in the U.S. who are 1/20th Native American, and then they claim Native American heritage. Meanwhile, the actual Native Americans are being repressed by the U.S. government. Similarly, in Taiwan, you have these authorities saying, we're indigenous. Well, they continue to repress the actual indigenous people, which, as you point out, the indigenous people are much more favorable toward the mainland, largely because in the mainland, they have this policy of strongly supporting the rights and the autonomy of different ethnic groups. I mentioned that according to mainland Chinese law, it officially says that there are 56 recognized ethnic groups, one of which is the Han, the majority, and there are 55 officially recognized ethnic minorities, and several of them have their own autonomous regions. And I've been to some of them. You can go and you see the public buildings and the signs and such, and they have their own language and they have Mandarin. Even here in Beijing, where I'm speaking to from now, you can go, for instance, there are different regions, different provinces and regions that have like their own buildings and such, and you can see that they have their language and also Mandarin. So ironically, the mainland treats the minorities much better than the Taiwanese authorities, who claim to be descendants of the indigenous people, which they're actually not.
Yes. So the ironies just seem endless. I think perhaps cynicism is a better word. But anyway,
Yeah.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late for you. You've had a long day. Thank you so much for joining the China Report.
It's my pleasure, and everyone at Breakthrough, you do great work, so it's always a real pleasure being here. Keep up the good work.
Can you say where people can follow your work?
Yeah. Everyone can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, and all the links are there, including the YouTube channel.
Thank you, Ben. And that's our show for today. Please like, subscribe, and share. And that is our show. Thank you, everybody.